Hi. So welcome everybody. And we're here for a discussion today, Bloomsbury Outsider Insider. And it's part of the events organised in connection with the exhibition, The Comrades, They Were Brave, We Salute You, which is curated by Cecilia Sjoholm. It brings together 7 contemporary artists who are all engaging with ideas of defiance. And the show's conceived as new work in homage to Edith Garrud, who's kind of fascinating figure of the Jiujitsu trainer to the suffragettes in a nutshell. She lived 1872 to 1971, which is kind of an amazing period. And the artist's work is right above us, and it takes as that starting point the theme of fighting for a cause, exploring kind of explicit acts of defiance and private resistance, objecting, making a space for yourself and others. And today we're interested in how that might relate actually to the district that we're in, Bloomsbury. Do we choose to fight openly in public, or are we more escape artists working outside of society, or do we camouflage ourselves to live the lives that we want to live or to make the changes that we do? Are all themes that have been looked at by the artists. And actually the building and the room we're sitting in is kind of emblematic of that to some extent. So 44 Great Russell Street was originally built in 1710 or thereabouts, as a kind of handsome London townhouse. And then now it's kind of slightly in camouflage because the Victorians refaced the whole front of this street to fit in better with the kind of Grecian grandeur when the British Museum was expanded to pretty much what we see now across the road. And of course we're in the heart of Bloomsbury, which I know a little bit about, but we're very honoured to have 2 very knowledgeable guests with us today to take us through navigating the sense of place in relation to the themes of the exhibition, and especially around the kind of intellectual life of Bloomsbury and also the suffragette history here in particular. So Dr. Naomi Paxton is a researcher and a performer herself. She's the Knowledge Exchange Fellow at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. She's a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, BBC Radio 3 Generation New Thinker, and has written several books on the suffragettes, particularly looking at the Actresses Franchise League. And I think you have some of those with you today. And to top it all off, you're a member of the Magic Circle and their Diversity and Inclusion Officer, is that right?
Yes.
Fantastic. And Dr. Matthew Ingleby, to my right, is an academic and also an author. He's a lecturer in Victorian Studies at the Department of English at Queen Mary, University of London. And you completed your PhD at UCL, I think, just up the road here in Bloomsbury as well. And his specialties are 19th and 20th century literary and cultural studies and the politics of space. And some of your books include 19th century fiction and the production of Bloomsbury, which I think is a fantastic title, and Bloomsbury Beyond the Establishment. So I thought maybe, Matthew, we could start off with you. Could you give us, if it's possible, a kind of very quick overview of kind of the development, I suppose, of Bloomsbury as a district in London, but also its development as an idea as well, and a place of ideas?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to return to work that I did a lot of intellectual kind of work in this area a few years ago. It's always nice to come back to think about the place in the place. So thanks for that. So you set it up by sort of explaining where we are now as in a house that's built at the beginning of the 18th century. And at that time, that was the very northern edge of London. And you'd look out across fields towards Hampstead, as the poet Cooper did, even as late as the 1760s. Basically, Bloomsbury, as we see it now, gets really going, gets kind of built very quickly, comparatively, in world history, from the 1770s on, when the Russell family, the Bedford estate, cashes in on this extremely newly expensive asset, land in London. Like all of the other aristocrats, they develop this land very, very quickly to try to make as much money from it as possible. And they build all these squares and streets that are north of Great Russell Street, largely from the late 18th century on. By the time you get to about 1840s, it's gone right up to where the Euston Road is, which was then called the New Road. So it's a very new kind of urban development, and the kind of the square as a form, the kind of linearity of this kind of spatial form was very new. It was designed for the very richest tenants, for people to be able to, get these big grand townhouses. But very quickly after these houses were built, the Bedford estate discovered that it didn't really attract quite the poshest kinds of tenants that they were hoping, because London was growing enormously at the time, and actually it became very fashionable for people who had lots of money to live further west. So they kind of move to near the park, so around Hyde Park and Regent's Park. And as a result, Bloomsbury sort of lost some of this cachet that it was actually built for, almost as soon as it was built. Now, that might sound a bit kind of boring, kind of estate agent kind of talk, but it's really a crucial thing to understand why Bloomsbury ends up as an intellectual centre and as a space of artistic innovation and political resistance, which is what the people in the gallery are kind of responding to. So over the course of the 19th century, just another little boring sort of estate agent. Another little boring estate agent kind of fact is this space was built on a 99-year lease system. Okay, so these posh families that they were trying to attract, they weren't buying a house in Bloomsbury. They would get a certain number of years on a lease. And it was done on a 99-year basis, so that the house would resume part of the Bedford estate if it was built in 1800 in 1899. Okay. As you can kind of think logically, this builds a certain kind of obsolescence, a certain kind of decline into the very model of this housing form. The further you go on into the lease, the less incentive there is for repairs to be done to keep this thing up. And as a result, the rental value of the property falls. And of course, this is being exacerbated by this broader social trend that people want to move west. So very quickly, Bloomsbury becomes a place associated not with posh families living in the whole townhouse, but in multiple occupancy housing. So these townhouses were very quickly converted into boarding houses. So after about 50 years, so the closer you get to the end of the leasehold, they're even more so becoming associated with kind of boarding houses, which were often kept by members of the kind of upper working class who'd saved up a bit of money and were taking on this project as a business. So they would often have a kind of strange social position in relation to their tenants, who would often be much posher than them. So single bachelors who were studying at university, or independent young women who are moving to the city and wanting to escape their kind of parents' kind of gaze, and they're mixing with people from different parts of the empire that are coming here to study, different ethnic minorities, different class positions. It's a kind of crucible for a certain kind of social mixture that doesn't happen anywhere else, and it's a direct result of that kind of leasehold system.
I suppose one thing I was kind of fascinated about in connection to that is, was there, apart from its kind of property structure and just availability of accommodation, what were the other things that made this a particular kind of site of a quite an eclectic mix, or a kind of fertile mix of people with different ideas or looking for different things? Was it its proximity between the city and Westminster, just to the north? Was it something to do with the stations, or was it, the British Museum across the road?
Yeah, so I mean, I think all of those things are relevant. I mean, I guess my point about the city's kind of expansion caters to your kind of first point. So I mean, it is right that Bloomsbury sort of falls between the cracks of the commercial and the residential, and so it has to create an identity for itself. But as you said, it's also a place that, I sort of said at the beginning that Bloomsbury's right at the northern edge of London in the 19th century, and that's one of the reasons why the railways are the stations are here. There's 3 massive railway stations to the north of London. And if you think in the 19th century, when I think that was the height of Bloomsbury's kind of radicalism, basically, places like Euston were not just kind of railway stations to the north of England and to Scotland. They were also, in a sense, a kind of extension of a port to the rest of the world. So if you think of, you might have seen the recent TV adaptation of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days that was on the BBC. The station that Phileas Fogg comes into London when he's gone all around the world is Euston. So it's an international station in the same way as St Pancras is today, right? But much more so. So it's more like the Heathrow of our city, right?
Was that to do with Liverpool?
Liverpool, exactly, yeah. And Glasgow. So, and then the other thing you said was, most importantly, yes, it's the institutions of Bloomsbury that are partly here because of this economic story that I've been telling about, essentially a kind of residential housing speculative development that doesn't quite make it. So as a result of that and these kind of falling rental yields, Bloomsbury becomes really ripe for institutional development. So it's the reason why the universities are largely fixed here. It's why they've been allowed to kind of largely expand, but also hospitals, really important hospitals, which I think you're going to talk about one of them as well. So basically Bloomsbury is a space of institutions, and that is the most important aspect of its history. So the British Museum is the central one of that. So it's built on the grounds of Montague House, so one of these big aristocratic spaces, but it becomes the most important democratic space within London. It's a space that's open to so it's where the library is as well as the museum, and that's very crucial.
So that's something people nowadays might almost forget. That the big rotunda in the middle of the kind of Norman Foster Court was actually the British Library, and that was where you went to read, to access the knowledge and to study, right?
Absolutely, and it was by far the most important library, but also site of intellectual production and political activism by extension in the world, right? So not even only in the Anglophone world, but also in the world more generally. Karl Marx, importantly, wrote Das Kapital here, so a work that was written in German, but he's writing it here. Lots and lots of Russian anarchists were here. Like London in the 19th century was the most liberal place in the world. It was a place where people who had sort of dangerous ideas, exciting ideas, were allowed to hang out. And the British Museum was the number one spot for all of that. So, yeah.
I think that's fascinating because I suppose maybe my misconception coming into this idea and this kind of topic is that Bloomsbury can appear quite genteel, I suppose, because its physical fabric was originally intended to capture that market, like you say, with its squares and perhaps the kind of synonymous now Bloomsbury group or Bloomsbury set who did lead perhaps quite radical lives in private and kind of really interesting artistic and thought-provoking kind of actions, but quite privileged. And actually to hear about this kind of fulcrum of all these other people from all over the world and different genders and different ages and classes kind of mixing because they're coming to kind of magnet of thinking is kind of really amazing. So I think is it Lenin also kind of lodged up the road at some point? Is that right? So there's kind of this whole mix.
Yeah, there's
of
a really
people.
funny. I mean, Bloomsbury is kind of. If it actually had all the blue plaques that it kind of deserved, you wouldn't be able to move for blue plaques. The Lenin one is quite a fun one. There's actually 2 blue plaques of where Lenin lived, with quite near to each other. One of them is in Clerkenwell, which is just sort of on the more disreputable kind of side of the Gray's Inn Road. But I really like the blue plaques of Lenin because it's right next to Jerome K. Jerome. So the kind of late comic kind of writer, and they lived there not like that different times, and I think that's tells you something. So I mean, I think the thing that Bloomsbury is really important for is its production of words. It's its production of thought and thinking through words, which then is intimately related to the kind of political movements that involve things other than words that we'll be thinking about in terms of the suffragettes. But that's its great product, basically. It's words. It's a kind of idea factory.
And that's a perfect segue, I think. And Naomi, I mean, I know there's pieces of suffragette history all around here, but could you kind of paint us a picture of what the scene was at the time of Edith Garrud's London, and who was around here, and what kind of suffragette movements were happening, and maybe some of those particular kind of places as well?
Sure. So I was very lucky in 2016. I started working at Senate House at the School of Advanced Study, and as part of the Being Human Festival in 2017, we put together a living literature walk called A Particular Theatre, based around the history of suffrage involvement in World War I and theatrical involvement in this area, and particularly the Shakespeare Hut, which was right in the middle of Bloomsbury, just outside where Senate House is now. It's really fascinating. So Edith Garrud was the trainer, the Jiujitsu trainer of the suffragette bodyguard. If you've had a look upstairs, you'll see a little bit about her there. A really interesting, fascinating history herself, and a fascinating kind of history of martial arts in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Not just Jiu-Jitsu, obviously, but particularly memorialised as Bartitsu in Sherlock Holmes, if any of you heard of that. She sort of initially learned Bartitsu at Edward Barton Wright's dojo. So, but the suffragettes is quite an interesting thing to look at in this area, because you have Emmeline Pankhurst, who initially had a home in Russell Square, where she set up a suffrage society before she set up the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, which she later set up in Manchester. But also,
so she was here first before Manchester?
Yeah, so she was in Manchester, then they moved here, actually, and they set up another suffrage society. That's before. And then you have Millicent Garrett Fawcett, who many of you may know, she's got the statue now in Parliament Square, who very famously lived here, and that's in a hotbed. The Garrett family is fascinating. So you've got Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who's the first sort of recognised doctor. We also have Rhoda and Agnes Garrett, who run the first female-run interior design business. There's still a beautiful ceiling. One of their ceilings is still in that house.
On Gower Street.
Yes, on Gower Street, and of course, which is the one right on the corner of Gower Street, and used to belong to Royal Holloway. If you have a look on the University of London blog, we did a piece about it for International Women's Day. Let's have a look there.
There's a blue plaque.
there is a blue plaque, actually, and of course you've got that old sort of legacy. You've got Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women in a house in Store Street, just right across the road from Senate House. So the sort of the legacies of words as well as actions within the suffrage movement in this area is really interesting. And so my particular research focuses on the contribution of theatre professionals to the suffrage movement, and that has been really interesting for me as a researcher, because the two groups that I look at, and particularly one, actually the Actresses Franchise League, but also the Women Writers Suffrage League, were both formed in 1908 and were made up of professional networks of creatives. They were initially all female, but they both had affiliated men's leagues by 1913, and they worked with everybody. They were politically neutral, which has meant for me as a researcher it's really interesting, because I've looked at the suffragettes, the militant, but I've also looked at the constitutional campaign. Of course, the constitutional campaign goes right back to the sort of the mid-19th century and is much more involved with the Garretts and all those first petitions to the Houses of Parliament before the sort of suffragette movement starts officially.
And for those of us who are slightly hazier on it, I mean, basically those are the two poles, aren't they, of the movement? You've got kind of Emmeline Pankhurst with the slightly more kind of militant end, and then Millicent Garrett Fawcett kind of with this kind of constitutional approach, right?
Yeah, so there are tens of suffrage societies. By the 1910s, by the time Edith Garrud is working in her dojo in Golden Square, just near Liberties, there are tens and tens of suffrage societies based on different professions, different locations, different political affiliations, different religious associations. There are all female ones, all male ones, and ones that are mixed as well. And so it's really interesting when we look at the history now that they've become so polarised. We sort of have the purple, white and green of the WSPU and then everybody else. But in fact, any colour that you might wear or see is a suffrage colour. The Actresses Franchise League were pink and green, and the Women Writers were black and gold, the Women's Freedom League were green, white and gold, the NUWS were red, any colour you have. So there's a lot of activism going on. And a key thing, I suppose, to remember with the suffragette movement is that it wasn't about inarticulate militancy. Even the militant campaigners were absolutely campaigning on constitutional grounds at the same time. And it was really about finding different ways to make themselves heard and also making political protest to damage property, for example, to make a political spectacle of themselves by getting arrested and then by hunger striking. And part of the issue, I think, or something that's hugely frustrated suffrage historians, is the way that we sort of fetishised in history these sort of bodies in pain, this sort of voyeuristic idea of this inarticulate militancy. That was one of my big things with the suffragette film that came out, was that we know they wanted the vote, but we never heard why. And one of the things in the suffrage movement is that they were constantly telling you why. And suffrage plays are a really great example of that, because they're about the reasons why. And of course there was theatrical censorship in this period. So one of the things I got asked, or one of the things I thought when I first started researching this work, is where are these voyeuristic plays about prison and forced feeding? And there were people writing plays like that, but they would not pass the censor. So when you look at the plays that did become published and did become produced in the UK and abroad in the US as well, they really weave in these issues, these ideas, these deeds with words about why people wanted the vote, what difference they thought it would make to people, the socio-economic backgrounds of all sorts of people, as well as sort of issues that we're still looking at today in terms of, violence against women and girls and sexual inequality and access to opportunities and education, representation, and professionalisation of various things, including the theatre industry. So Edith Garrud, the sort of the 1911-1912 period, is a really interesting time. There's been a lot of amazing militant actions that have been very visible, that have been very hookable, that have kind of caught the imagination of the newspapers. There's been lots of times the government have let the women down, have promised various things and then retreated from those things. And there's a real sense of a burgeoning, energetic visibility on the streets. And that is absolutely happening here in Bloomsbury as well as in other parts of London. But the visibility here, I think, is really interesting. And when we get to World War I, that ownership, that agency of those suffrage women who spent all those years building those networks and working slightly outside the mainstream because they've had to, suddenly kind of pays amazing fruition, and they do fantastic work.
And when we think of that kind of idea of getting the message out on the streets, is that leafleting? Is that people talking on street corners around Bloomsbury? How does it manifest?
So probably maybe the thing you might most have seen if you weren't there on a demonstration day was suffrage newspapers sellers. So most of the the largest suffrage societies had their own newspapers, some weekly, some monthly, and part of the ritual for many women was this selling newspapers on the streets, a very different way of being visible in public space as an activist. Anyone who stood around in an activist t-shirt, even handing out leaflets, knows how that makes you feel. And selling suffrage newspaper was a huge thing. So you might have seen that. You would have seen suffrage shops. You'd have seen suffrage societies all over the place. And one of the curious things I found most interesting about suffrage theatre, for example, is that it wasn't happening often in mainstream spaces. They would do the odd one in a big venue as a fundraiser, but mostly it was happening in roller skating rinks and in vegetarian restaurants and in ice skating rinks and on street corners and in halls and in people's drawing rooms. It was theatre. They didn't do all female Shakespeares or reinvent the classics. They made new work based exactly on the things that they were experiencing, and then took that around the country. They made participatory work and applied theatre work, things that I suppose that we don't think of until later in the 20th century, like site-specific or immersive theatre. But they're doing that, and it's not naively done. It's very consciously moving outside of the commercial model of theatre. So I think my first thought on that would be newspaper sellers. But if I fantasise myself back onto the streets of 1911, and I would hot-foot it to the Votes for Women shop on Charing Cross Road, and have a look at all the kind of brilliant branding and publicity that they managed to get out there. But I think certainly you would have seen women on the streets, and you would have noticed the colours, all the colours being used in very specific ways.
And there was like headquarters down towards Lincoln's Inn, weren't there? And there was various publishing happening just in the streets
Absolutely,
around.
Women's Press, yes, and then further down into Covent Garden. I mean, I discovered in my research that the three main Edwardian crazes were jiu-jitsu, vegetarianism and roller skating. And the suffragettes were all over them. They were pretty much everywhere.
You mentioned the Shakespeare Hut, which I didn't know about. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes.
How did that work in this area?
Yeah, I'm just going to... the expert on the Shakespeare Hut is Dr. Ailsa Grant-Ferguson, who's from the University of Brighton. And when we put together this event in 2017, the Shakespeare Hut stood on the site of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine.
So that's just to the north, a few blocks north. Yeah.
So Hut is misleading. It was an enormous sort of series, mock Tudor series of rooms, and it was a YMCA hut built for the use of Anzac soldiers in World War One. So Australian and New Zealand soldiers who were here on leave. Rather than going all the way home, they came here, and part of a huge network of YMCA huts. They had the Beaver Hut down on the Strand, and the Eagle Hut for American soldiers and Canadian soldiers. But it was actually, so it stood there from 1916 to 1923, but that land was built by the Shakespeare National Theatre by the Shakespeare National Memorial Theatre Committee, all of those words, because it was intended to be the site of the National Theatre. And there, if you look in the archives of the National Theatre, there are decades of umming and ahhing about where this theatre should be, and it should celebrate Shakespeare's tercentenary. And they finally purchased this land to build this enormous National Theatre, and then war breaks out. So Israel Gallants sort of lends the land to the YMCA, and they build this Shakespeare Hut, and it's the only YMCA hut in London that has a dedicated theatre space inside it. And the people who are running the theatre space are the Actresses Franchise League, particularly Gertrude Elliott.
During the war.
During the war. So Gertrude Elliott and Johnston Forbes Robertson. Gertrude Elliott is the president of the Actresses Franchise League. They live on Bedford Square. There is a plaque to Johnston Forbes Robertson, who is a very good egg, but it's nothing to her, sadly. And they are they are the entertainment committee of the Shakespeare Hut. So they don't know it, but the Anzac soldiers on leave are seeing bits of radical feminist theatre that are happening.
And did they take that back to Australia?
There are some really interesting accounts of what they see there, and of kind of that hut being a home from home, and the experiences of Kiwi soldiers in London during the war. But I'm just going to have a look at else. Yeah, so it actually, then that land, obviously the impetus to build that thing and honour Shakespeare's tercentenary had died really after the war ended. So the hut becomes, it gets left to the Indian YMCA actually, and again becomes an interesting hub of sort of intellectuals and major figures in the kind of the movement for Indian independence.
And Matthew, that really kind of brings us back to that point about this space that's central enough but kind of down at heel a bit enough to purchase a big parcel of land, to put some sort of national institution, the British Library, the British Museum, the National Theatre. Like, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Now obviously it's on the South Bank with another big British national kind of moment post Second World War, but that kind of Indian and empire and this kind of mix of people, is there anything kind of around the militancy and the kind of ferment of ideas that happened in this neighbourhood?
Yeah, definitely. I was kind of sparked off by what you were saying about the Shakespeare Hut, because the Indian connection is the bit that I kind of know of that story. I had no idea about the suffrage connections. So Bloomsbury, because of, as I've sort of explained, because of Bloomsbury's kind of sort of down at heel kind of nature, and its kind of way that it had kind of lost rental yield, it becomes possible for institutions to expand, and they are often institutions that play sometimes unwittingly important roles in radical struggles. Not least of which is the women's emancipation, but also anti-colonial struggles. So Bloomsbury specifically becomes a kind of hotbed of anti-colonial discussion, politicisation, mobilisation. People like Gandhi is a law student here in the 1880s. But from all over the British Empire, so this is in addition to this kind of idea of Bloomsbury as this kind of like harbour of, revolutionary kind of thought, which starts off in the middle of the 19th century, right? with Karl Marx and all these kind of Russian anarchists, etc. But at the beginning of the 19th century, it's largely lots of students from India, from the Caribbean, such as C.L.R. James, so very important Trinidadian Marxist historian, who is remembered today for being the person to really make the strong claim that the Haitian slave rebellion at the beginning of the 19th century is one of the most important world historical events that gets sort of conveniently kind of written out of the history of progress according to a kind of Western kind of eyes, which sees the French Revolution as most important. And it's actually the Haitians who say, hang on, what about us? Just as Mary Wollstonecraft says, hang on, what about us? And C.L.R. James is a student in the 1930s in this area, and this is a little paragraph from his memoirs about living in the area. And he says in Bloomsbury, discussion moves from D.H. Lawrence to Bolshevik Russia to sex to the Indian question to British imperialism to Abyssinia to coloured students in London. That's just a normal Bloomsbury kind of conversation because of the kinds of interest that all the people who are living here have. And this is what he says. It's just a typical day he's giving us of his life in Bloomsbury. I delivered the lecture that night to the Society of International Students. In the very same building, Mr. C.F. Andrews was speaking to another society interested in Indian nationalism, and people from his meeting kept on coming into mine. The lecture was fairly successful because after it was finished, I received 2 invitations, one to join the Friends of India Society, which meets on the first Monday of every month, and the other to lecture on any subject connected with the West Indies at the Indian Students' Central Association. You might think that was enough for one day. You simply do not know Bloomsbury, right? So you just kind of get that sense. Firstly, in some ways, this is it's kind of like it's got the same form of what in the popular imagination Bloomsbury is like through the kind of mythology that the Bloomsbury group kind of purvey, right? So that idea of feverish, interested conversation between very intellectual people who are curious and kind of like hanging out, and there's kind of relationship between conviviality and intellectual stimulation. But C.L.R. James's story, I think, is the more important one. This is the 1930s, a couple of decades down the line. The anti-colonial struggle has won, right? So it has major world historical effects, and of course, this is part of Bloomsbury's role. So it's where these ideas happen. So these two, the West Indies, right? It's got a colonial name, but in this paragraph we see C.L.R. James seeing the Indian and the West Indian kind of see that they actually have a lot in common through their subjugation, and coming together, swapping notes about how to get rid of the colonial oppressors. And that's all happening in Bloomsbury, and it couldn't have happened anywhere else.
I love that idea that kind of these august, seemingly, colonial and imperial institutions that have kind of sucked in all of that world are now the very places under these kind of gilded domes that these ideas and their kind of undoing is being written out or discussed at lunch breaks and things like that. One of the kind of events or the kind of, and I think that's to me, that's the kind of insider outsider nature, which I think some of the art also really talks about in interesting ways upstairs, of those places where you might be having certain thoughts or certain feelings, and when that comes out and breaks out into public life and onto the streets. One of the events that I kind of am really fascinated by is the memorial service for Emily Davison, the suffragette. And she strikes me as a real insider outsider, and probably got this bit wrong, but kind of very middle class kind of life. But this was a woman who was arrested 9 times, went on hunger strike 7 times, force-fed, many times, and she famously died after running onto the track at the Derby in 1913 and being hit by the King's horse. And Naomi, can you tell us a little bit about the events around her funeral cortege and things that happened in this area?
Sure. Yes, I mean, that was a huge shock for particularly the WSPU, her death. And in fact, at the time that happened, there was a festival going on. The WSPU's Summer Festival was happening in 1913, and one of the centrepieces was a statue of Joan of Arc, which then became part of her memorial. So we have sort of the pre and post Emily Walton-Davison's death photos of this Joan of Arc, and she wasn't the first, but she became really a huge martyr for the cause. And her funeral procession happened at St George's, Bloomsbury. Again, a really interesting example of that visual suffrage propaganda, the use of the colours, the women in white bringing the cortege through, thousands of people on the streets. I mean, they had the service there, and then she was actually buried in Northumberland, in Morpeth, I think, where she's from. Her grave is there. But that whole, the visual spectacle of that, the idea of martyrdom. Of course, I would relate it to suffrage theatre, but there is an interesting intellectual. So Christopher St John, who is a journalist and a writer, and initially she's an actress, but she becomes part of that kind of intellectual elite, and she writes a play called Her Will, and it sort of tells the story of Emily Walton-Davison's funeral, but also brings in the history of another suffrage martyr, Constance Lytton. I don't know if any of you know about Constance Lytton's story. She was an aristocratic campaigner for the WSPU, and she was arrested for nominally throwing a stone, I think, initially. And because she was an aristocrat and she had a heart condition, she was kept in hospital in the prison. And she very much felt that she hadn't had the real experience of being a suffragette because people knew who she was. And so she then dressed herself up as a seamstress, bought old-fashioned Victorian clothes and changed her hair and bought different glasses, and threw a stone at the Prime Minister's car and got arrested as Jane Wharton, seamstress. And they didn't give her the full medical check because they didn't know she was an aristocrat, and they did put her, she did go on hunger strike, she was forcibly fed, it made her very ill, she had a stroke afterwards, and eventually it was found out who she was. But the fact that she'd gone through this for the cause, that at any point she could have said, actually, I'm not Jane Wharton, I'm Lady Constance Lytton, but she didn't. So she was one of the sort of first martyrs for the suffrage movement, and then of course Emily Walton-Davison the second. And Christopher St John writes a play called Her Will, which sort of melds these stories together, sort of set after the funeral of a wealthy militant suffragette from a fictional union. She puts the colours as red, purple and gold, so a really nice unification of that, and has this huge procession coming up at a sort of unnamed church in Bloomsbury. But this idea of martyrdom and sacrifice, obviously this has been coming up again and again in the suffrage movement with the sort of prison breakfast where released suffragettes would talk about their experiences being force-fed, or even prison cell installations that were happening, which were mocked-up prison cells where you could go inside at exhibitions and meet a real suffragette prisoner and hear her story. So again, sort of raising up those sort of forgotten voices, but also thinking about ideas of women in the criminal justice system. Actually, what did you have to do to get arrested? I think a lot of the things that radicalised quite a lot of women in this period was the fact that you didn't have to do anything violent, you just had to be somewhere. In fact, Christopher St John herself was arrested for just being at or observing. She said she was observing a suffrage demonstration, but she was arrested for being near it. So this idea of physical pain, of the immense sadness that Emily Walton-Davison had. She'd already tried to throw herself off balconies. She'd been locked in cells and had water thrown, hosed through the door at her. She'd endured this physical sort of torture and this intellectual torture for her political ideas. And this final act, happening as it did in the middle of that festival, then allowed the suffrage movement, which had become really fractured by 1913, lots of peeling off in different directions, lots of large-scale arguments about militancy and the relevance of militancy, to sort of come together in this moment of, and I think it's interesting that all these women walk across in white, this idea of purity, this something is higher and happening, and then we have this wonderful ceremony here at St George's, Bloomsbury, and it becomes a real sort of a moment of stillness in the campaign. And even the Actors Franchise League, who are politically neutral, send a large bouquet of lilies saying, sort of in memory from some members of the Arestis franchise, because there was so much conversation about militancy. But yeah, it's a huge spectacle, and I think it's probably, am I lying? I think it might be the last big spectacle before the First World War, and it's interesting that actually that idea of sacrifice and martyrdom for something bigger than yourself happens just before then. The war starts in 14, and then we get other female figures like Edith Garrud, for example, who become mythologized in different ways.
And what a kind of setting as well, that building, it's so, and it almost kind of lends it kind of state funeral kind of vibe, and the marching through. I think that idea of, I think they were taking the coffin to the station, weren't they, to take it to Northumbria.
But you've also got that line particularly from that thing, the fact that it's in Hogarth. Actually, you've got that line, that kind of class line about what is visible and what isn't visible, and what is mythologized and what stories are told and what stories are not told. And sometimes, we've been saying about deeds with words, but I think the power of those images, the stillness of that memorial, I think has real power, especially in that building.
And Matthew, was there something about that church? Why this parish? Was it just because it was central? Was it more tolerant?
Yeah, so it's got a long tradition of kind of liberal kind of preaching from the middle of the 19th century. It is a place, again, because of Bloomsbury's association with kind of radicalism, it's a space that does kind of have connections with various kind of institutions that are kind of around. But I think a lot of it is, so on one kind of mundane level, it is because it's near the stations and it's on the way there and it's a big place that's there. But there are many churches that would not have agreed to participate in what was obviously, a kind of mass political statement. And I was just interested about what you were saying about this being on the kind of threshold of war. One of the things they did that are both deeds and words was sing. And the Times actually reported on the funeral these different songs and hymns that people were singing, where there's a band that's playing either the Dead March, what you would expect, but also the Marseillaise. But also there are banners that have inscriptions like "Fight on and God will give us the victory," "Thoughts have gone forth whose power can sleep no more," and which I think is very interesting, "Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori," which are words that then we know
from the first
through Wilfred Owen's appropriation of them. As his kind of sardonic reply to a kind of patriotism that had, thrown so many working class men on the heap. But they're using it also in a consciously kind of subversive way, right? Taking something patriarchy, turning it against that. It's very theatrical, but it is words, isn't it? It's words and deeds.
Yeah, I think there's something about that intergenerational thing. I'm thinking with the band particularly. Am I all right? The WSPU's drum and fife band there were suffrage societies for children. So the drummers' union was for boys and girls aged 6 to 21, and that was made up of children who were part of the drummers, the fife band. And then there was the Young Purple, White and Green Club. These kind of young intellectuals who put plays on and write plays themselves, and they give us a glimpse really into how switched on young people were with the kind of constitutional arguments, and also how much they were dreaming of future generations who would be able to work together, have the same opportunities. And it's really interesting that you have people like Millicent Garrett-Fawcett who've been around, for decades, and then you'll have sort of a 10-year-old who has a dream of the future in which women and men have equal access to opportunities. And one of the things I think it's interesting about Edith Garrud, for example, this sort of performative violence and the consequences of that violence. Emily Wilde-Davison is a classic, the major example of that. But this sort of Edith Garrud's demonstrations, this sort of bloodlessness, the idea of in jiu-jitsu, where you're using it's essentially defensive. You're using somebody's weight against you, so it's quite hard to disapprove of a demonstration of jiu-jitsu, even if you're against militancy. But there are performative parts of violence, like suffrage punch and Judy shows, for example, which I've done some research into, which I think is really interesting. And they were performed by the Men's Political Union. So having a suffrage punch who is punching up at the government instead of across the playboard at Judy radicalises that whole story very differently. And they were being performed by children as well as adults. So this idea of changing the very fabric of, or questioning, I suppose, questioning the fabric of the stories, of the roles, of the gender roles, of the class roles, of the expectations for boys and girls, for men and women, and what that might mean for a wider political, patriotic future is really important. I think that funeral's a really good example. You have the grand suffragettes, these women who've been doing it for decades, and then you have people in the drum and fife band who are young and are already dreaming of what's going to happen later on in the century, obviously not knowing what's going to happen next.
And the drum and fife becoming maybe more associated with that militaristic thing. But I love that kind of connection between, it's the Jiujitsu move, isn't it? It's like you're using the kind of the nation and this kind of idea of the nation's future, or these august institutions kind of like their way to make change. Yes. It's the Jiujitsu
I mean, it's
move.
Interesting that, it's funny, isn't it? Again, it's this kind of question of how these things are received, which is also always a problem. There's a lovely Punch cartoon of the suffrage movement's kind of relationship to jiu-jitsu, which I'm sure you know, which I've sort of come into because I'm obsessed with railings. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is the politics of railings, and this cartoon sort of takes this defensive martial art, which is all about, as you said, it's sort of it's basically the less kind of aggressive kind of form, but has this wonderful picture of this suffragette who's just thrown all of these policemen over the railings and onto the railings. So there's like these police impaled with railings, like dying because of this triumphant kind of woman who's sort of bring it on kind of thing. But I was going to say, just this idea, something you were saying there about the future, and I think this is one, and youth and that kind of thing. Again, I think this is one of the most important aspects of Bloomsbury. It's a place that it sort of enables people to think about the future. It enables them to talk about the future and to plan for a future. And there's lots of debates that happen within all sorts of political kind of organisations about how one gets from A to B. But one of the things Bloomsbury enables is just that futurism, that kind of thinking about something, and that's to go back to this idea of these houses and the sort of banal aspect of it. There's a little bit, if I can read another little section. So in the decades just before the suffragette kind of phenomenon, which is quite well known, that comes out of a real flowering of feminist kind of thought in the 1890s, which is part of a broader kind of shift to the left, a kind of maturation of the British kind of intellectual and political kind of scene, where kind of radical anarchist and Marxist thinking starts to kind of really percolate around the system. Many of these feminists and socialists, often socialist feminists, were based around Bloomsbury, partly because, as I sort of said before, you could afford to live here. It's cheap enough to be able to afford to live here, and you needed to do your research in the British Museum. That's basically where you would have to write, because that's where you could get access to all of the books that you needed to research, but also the social networks, the friends, the kind of people that could support you, so important to the suffrage movement. So one really interesting forgotten, and one of many really interesting radical women from that period who were associated with Bloomsbury is a woman called Isabella Ford. Very, very important in theorising the relationship of feminism and socialism. Talks about kind of questions about women's work before that's kind of been really filtered into what was at the time, class politics wasn't largely thinking about kind of gender. And she writes a novel that's set in Bloomsbury called On the Threshold. And it's kind of on the threshold of the two young women's lives, one of whom they both enjoy the kind of freedom that Bloomsbury offers them, the intellectual seriousness of it, the kind of possibility to have respite from a kind of heteronormative, patriarchal kind of world, which is expecting them to settle down and have children. One of them goes on to reject that kind of world. The other one marries a nice posh man. You have to have those alternatives that happen. But right at the beginning of it, where they're still together and they're still mates, they're art students, so they're the Slade around the corner, right? They talk about this like boarding house in Bloomsbury, which is like so different from the kind of rather nice posh house that they both of them have grown up in. But it's in precisely that kind of lack of kind of creature comforts that the real stuff comes in, reality and the possibility of this future that they're going to make together comes in. So this is a little bit from that, from On the Threshold. The hard, stiff sofa, the hideous sideboard, the one comfortable chair, comfortable only because the bottom was gradually bursting out, seemed like enchanted furniture out of fairyland, the fairyland of freedom, where no authoritative or disapproving eye was perpetually on us. The view from the window onto a macadamised road with dingy houses opposite, each exactly alike, a road perpetually blocked with heaps of sharp stones and a snorting road-mending engine, was like the outlook from the windows of a house in paradise, and the engine was like a band of silver trumpets blowing triumphant hymns to liberty. And what I like about this is I think it kind of goes back to this kind of question of the inside and the out, and we, thinking about the way in which Emily Davison's martyrdom is a huge kind of public event in the way it's kind of written out, but obviously, her experience and many women's decision to join that movement is born of very kind of private, kind of everyday experiences that are really kind of never brought entirely on show. And this is this is part of this a kind of genre of political feminist writing by this socialist feminist Isabella Ford, that is kind of testifying to the way in which things which are kind of not really seen can nonetheless be like a band of silver trumpets blowing triumphant hymns to liberty, i.e. something really public and loud and proud kind of thing.
Yeah, there is something about, particularly women, but women and men who are able to use their privilege or have the financial backing in order to be able to protest or to be out of work or to be in prison or to have somebody to look after your kids. I mean, there's one of the women who started the Actresses Franchise League said that she was never a militant because she couldn't afford to have her teeth broken, because their teeth would often be broken with the wooden gags. And when you look in the Royal Theatrical Fund records, most of the actors and actresses writing in for support are writing in for dental work anyway. So the prospect of potentially having your voice ruined from being force-feed or have your teeth broken means you can't go then and earn your work as a freelancer. So there is a real privilege in being able to step up and be that visible front line. But that absolutely doesn't mean that there's not lots of other engagement, activism, modelling, support happening behind the scenes, or even in a less showy way.
Yeah, and those everyday questions and meetings between people that we've heard about today. I was interested, you mentioned that the characters in that book are visual art students at the Slade. I think the Slade's quite an interesting institution as well, because even now, it's kind of, from the outside at least, seems it's a very proper art school. And could you talk a little, either of you, I don't know, about that connection, maybe in a similar way as the literary connection to the British Museum? I mean, to the artifacts of the British Museum and the visual arts in this area, and perhaps how it connects to various things that we already discussed today.
Well, I suppose with the visual arts, I'd immediately go to Sylvia Pankhurst, of course, and her extraordinary work. And I suppose the layering of meanings, or one of her big murals for the exhibitions, the WSP exhibitions, used to sort of invoke the broad arrow, obviously of the prison uniform, but also the pelican, her piety, the idea of sacrifice of motherhood, of the dove of peace going out, of people sowing seeds, of sort of bringing in all these religious themes as well as these very political, overt themes in order to try and appeal to as many people as possible. But the visual art of the suffrage movement is another whole huge topic, which I'm afraid is not my area of expertise, but my response to that would be Sylvia Pankhurst.
So Bloomsbury, I suppose the bit of the story that people kind of know well is the Bloomsbury Group's contribution to art and also to art criticism, because in some ways, Roger Fry and Clive Bell's kind of contributions to kind of thinking about what art is are as important as the actual art being produced by members of the Bloomsbury Group. But as with all things to do with the Bloomsbury Group, there is a kind of way in which they have screened the preponderance of different forms of kind of activity within that area, and sort of assumed it to themselves in a kind of slightly weird branding exercise that makes people forget that actually Bloomsbury had been associated with kind of radical and interesting art since the beginning of the 19th century. I mean, I'll give you a few things which are really important to know. In the 19th century, all the way through the 19th century, the British Museum was the centre of British drawing training. Okay, so why? Because we have all those lovely statues that have been nicked from Greece. So basically, Bloomsbury, that was the central means by which British artists learnt to draw. Why can't I remember the names? What am I talking about?
Not so
the statues that were nicked from the Parthenon.
The Elgin Marbles.
The Elgin Marbles, yeah. So the Elgin Marbles, basically...
The Parthenon frieze.
The Parthenon frieze, exactly. So basically, I mean, that's one of the most interesting aspects of the British Museum's kind of visual culture. So firstly, that right from the beginning, the very presence of these statues sparks a kind of political debate that Byron kind of gets into and is still going on today about the politics of museums, which is kind of central to any museum studies course you do now, would be about precisely this space. But that it also has this very productive kind of role in shaping British art, because it is where people without money, who can't afford to pay for models, can still be able to get a sense of how to draw male anatomy, which was the highest form of thing you could possibly draw. I mean, who am I to complain about that? I don't know. But that was very important. Secondly, I guess the other thing that I find really interesting about Bloomsbury's relationship to art is its relationship to the decorative arts and to what I guess we would call craft, and the relationship between art and craft. So William Morris moves to Bloomsbury, not unlike many other recent Oxford undergraduates in the 19th century. So he moves to Great Ormond Street and has a very interesting relationship with the area. So basically his studio in Queen's Square is where all the kind of, all these wallpapers and stuff that you'll know have huge influence on the world. I mean, the most interesting thing about William Morris is not for me his wallpaper, but again, his politics, his political ideas. So he was the most significant native British revolutionary in the 19th century. He was one of those people that read Karl Marx in the 1880s and was hugely transformed by his vision. But before that, he'd already sort of begun like a kind of political journey. He basically was very important in kind of radicalising John Ruskin's kind of ideas about the everyday nature of kind of the aesthetic and the art, and the importance of kind of embedding art education into broader kind of social kind of relations. One of the most interesting books that he writes is set partly in Bloomsbury and imagines a post-revolutionary society in which people can spend their lives pursuing kind of different forms of kind of everyday beauty, and that's become embedded in nature. But this is all after quite a bloody struggle with capitalism, which he doesn't write out of the picture. So I find William Morris's kind of honesty about the relationship of art to these kind of bigger questions about how to change the world more interesting than the Bloomsbury group's response, which I find a bit more fudgy.
It's a really interesting book by Cicely Hamilton, who's part of the Actress Franchise League and Women Writers Suffrage League, called Marriage as a Trade. And if you don't know, I urge you to look it up, it's fascinating. But she writes really interestingly in this period and gives speeches in this period about allowing people some space for intellectual growth, particularly around women. She says, stop fighting, about, she said this, women have only just been allowed to think, allowed to be educated, give us time, allow us to disagree, allow us to try out, our own intellectual capabilities, allow us to find different ways to mould this world and don't try and shoehorn us into these existing structures. And it's one of the most interesting things for me about the movement and its connection with words, particularly in this area, is that idea somehow of peeling back. That's really hard for all of us to do, is to come out of those structures and look again, if I could build this, would it be like this? No, how would it be? And how much of those sort of systemic inequalities are so embedded in our language. And one of the interesting things that the suffrage writers do particularly is to really try and peel out those threads and go, hang on, let's not take this as read. Where would we start if we could start again? And also, give us a break, or give ourselves a break in terms of, we don't have this legacy. She writes, and Elizabeth Robbins writes about, look at a bookshelf, look at all the stories that are there. Where are the women's stories of courage? They're not about motherhood, they're not about love, they're about great adventures. And Elizabeth Robbins writes very movingly to the women writer, says to the Women Writers Suffrage League, you find language, what does she say? Something about your great adventure. Women, you find woman at the dawn. She says that her great adventure is before her, and your great adventure is to write that for her, for future generations. So it's not just kind of coming in and adopting existing structures, however radical and exciting they are. It's absolutely thinking again about making new structures and giving yourself the intellectual space to engage with them.
Fantastic. I mean, I think we could kind of go on all day, couldn't we? But we do actually have quite a few of the artists with us and others in the room. And I was just wondering if anybody had any questions or comments or anything they wanted to add to the discussion.
Just I'm really interested in that idea about space and just how kind of space is structurally taken away from us. And how we're kind of constantly kind of producing and consuming, and how do we kind of make that space that we can kind of be more radical in our everyday lives and be more radical collectively.
Is that something you kind of responded to specifically in the work in this show, do you think?
Yes, I just think we're just sort of made so kind of perpetually busy. That we don't get time to kind of think for ourselves or to collectivise and to meet other sort of people and sort of kind of come together. How do we gain that? How do we get that sort of regain that agency? I mean, it's a huge kind of sort of question, isn't it?
Big question. I mean, and maybe it relates quite interestingly though to something we were discussing before about, is Bloomsbury still radical, or what's the legacy, and that it had this kind of the idea of collectivization or finding the time or the space, literally physical space where you can have those conversations and meet those people. And obviously, one could say it's moved online, it's disseminated in such a different way today, but I don't know, is there something about why does this still have some resonance in this neighbourhood or to this place?
Isn't there? I mean, I'm not too keen on the word sort of psychogeography, but there is something that you can kind of really sort of feel. There is an excitement here. But it's sort of particularly sort of like we're really worried about sort of, the Human Rights Act and all these things, our sort of ability to collectivise and to kind of demonstrate is being eroded, structurally eroded, right now constitutionally.
Well, no, I mean, yes. I don't have an answer particularly, but I think it was, for me, I suppose as a historian, it's about legacy and acknowledgement, or particularly when you look at the work of women in this period, and radical women, political women, theatrical women, it's about the hidden in plain sight. I haven't had to go. I mean, I've done some digging, but most of the things I found have just not been part of the conversation.
No, we don't know about them, do we?
Right, but it's not because I found a trunk, and suddenly, ta-ding, it's just because they haven't haven't been considered important or relevant, or they've considered to be outliers and therefore not helpful to the conversation. You mentioned a bit hospitals earlier, but I was thinking when we did that walk around Bloomsbury for the Being Human Festival, and we were looking at the plaques that are there, and it's interesting, when you look at alternative blue plaques, women's history blue plaques, or LGBTQI plus plaques, the kind of histories, legacies, these underlying legacies within this area particularly, that actually it's so important. It is important to have that static thing on the wall. It's important to go, so-and-so lived here, Jerome King lived here. It is important to say Johnston Forbes Robertson lived here. And then, but what is missing? And I suppose it's that constant idea of reinvigorating or reframing that legacy and trying to make it as visible as possible, despite the sort of public history squashing of it. I don't have a solution, but I suppose the best thing we can do is talk and think and engage and go, where is this? And look for it, because it certainly will be there. And I think maybe even thinking of sort of feminist geographers working in this area, going, actually, who has ownership over this space and why, and what are the legacies of that? So I suppose it's about challenging that legacy for me.
So I would say a lot of the dynamics that produced Bloomsbury's radicalism, the particular space or time or kind of temporality, spatial temporality that it enabled its production of radical ideas, has gone. There are a number of reasons why that's the case. As you sort of mentioned, there's a way in which everything going online means that the kind of way in which territory or territorial kind of identity becomes less obviously important in the production of ideas, and therefore any particular place doesn't have quite so much kind of absolute necessity in the production and circulation of ideas as it did until really the birth of the internet. That's one thing. I mean, on a kind of more banal level, even more banal than that, all the stuff I was saying about Bloomsbury's kind of decline economically, that enabled its centralisation in terms of intellectual production and social kind of pioneering stuff, bohemianism, etc., has, been done away with because of gentrification. So, I mean, all the way through the 19th century, London has a very interesting way in which its speculative building often over-exceeds the demand in different ways, so that different areas decline, and they often become the most interesting areas in London. And so London's kind of gentrification has reversed its kind of particular interest in terms of production of new identities. I mean, if you're really rich, you don't really need to invent any new ideas. You've got far more interesting things to do because you've got the money to do it. So that's a problem. Two things I would say. I mean, this is a very specific thing that I have a bit of a kind of annoying thing about. The British Museum used to be where the British Library is. And the separation of those two institutions, I think, has led to the de-radicalisation of both of them. There was something particularly valuable about the space, which is the kind of collection of expropriated colonial kind of products, and the place in which international revolutionary exiles are congregating to write against empire, etc. To have that juxtaposition, I think, was really helpful, and the fact that it's not happening, and in fact both institutions seem very intent on kind of keeping their brand identities very separate, I think is a problem. Just more broadly, if there was an element of Bloomsbury as a space of radicalism and innovation, both in sort of sexual terms and in terms of a more broader kind of political struggles, it will still be because of its institutional nature. Mm. So the places you want to go if you're interested in politics will be the student unions of SOAS, of UCL, etc. I think the most political, moment in Bloomsbury's history in the last 20 years was the occupation of UCL's grandest kind of buildings at the time when the Tories brought in their outrageous tuition fees increase, which has led to the decimation of the humanities within universities and is continuing to lead to Britain's declining kind of role in fomenting kind of intellectual innovation. So that was an exciting political kind of moment that I think does kind of link to Bloomsbury's kind of role in active kind of political engagement. But was it the last hurrah? Who knows?
But I like the idea that it's the institutions that are both kind of consuming all these buildings now, because the boarding houses maybe aren't here. It's because
they're all
London's
become
so big.
Yeah.
And so, but that's also will be the roof where these things will kind of maybe spring up continually. I don't know if there were any other comments or connections maybe to the work itself upstairs, or a sense of how this place or the conversations you guys had in this building and in this neighbourhood leading up to the exhibition might have influenced it.
Rabbit in the headlights. I guess it is some sort of something, or coming back slightly to you, and it's, you almost get jealous, don't you, when you hear about this sort of Bloomsbury history, and you can just picturing all this activity inside the British Library and on the streets, and you're just like, where is this nowadays? And I guess it is because it's online, but I think what I really enjoyed when curating this show, and we had our conversations, is that you are in a room and you do sit down, because I think it's so important to just physically sort of see each other and have a conversation in a very different way, which I guess you can't really. I mean, in one sense, it's amazing you can have a conversation with someone around on the other side of the world, but I think for me, I really value those moments of just being in a space with thoughts, and you just like, because so often I guess also when you have a conversation, it's about being able to change it, or sort of, you're saying this, I can say that. But I find if you're online, that you lose that whole flow of thought, and maybe that's why I got so jealous listening to what happened 100 years ago here.
But I think even just having our shared space is quite interesting post-lockdown. Why here? Because it's central, and actually it's the centrality of it, whether it's in the Empire or whether it's in the Institute or just in London, because I live in West and you live in East, and there is something about just being able to be here and have the art physically in this room where actually it's kind of within half an hour of everyone that I think is quite special.
I was going to say, because I learned that the room that my piece is installed in was a wig room, which I couldn't even imagine, like having a space day now that was just for my wigs.
Yeah. And how this building itself has kind of changed from that original wealth family that might have lived here through all of its iterations and things.
I was just struck by the point actually about the scale of London and how Bloomsbury was previously the kind of limit, and then you're looking out across fields, which is quite a striking thought, where when you consider how big London is now, and sort of travelling to other European cities. I don't know, maybe does the scale of the city actually help? When you can cross a city on a bike in 20 minutes, and you can be at all the institutions, you can be at the coffee shops, you can be at the bars, you can actually have those conversations much more easily, and maybe those cities are more at the scale that London was then. Now, if I want to visit Alex, I have to travel an hour and a half, so is it anything about the physical scale of the city that also perhaps?
But I mean, I totally understand what you mean, and there's a lot of interesting work on 18th century like coffee house culture, and when London was much smaller and you did walk everywhere. But actually, the time when Bloomsbury becomes most significant in terms of its intellectual and political kind of production I didn't really tell that bit of the story, but London starts off as very small. But if you actually look at the growth of it from 1800, when most of Bloomsbury isn't built, to 1900, when over 50 years Bloomsbury's kind of been built and is by far being surpassed by all these other outer suburbs. London grows from 1 million to 6.5 million within the space of 100 years, and it is by far the most rapid space. So by the end of the century, which is, really when Bloomsbury is the most important intellectual space in the Anglophone world, London is almost as big as it is now. But the thing that's interesting about it is that geography matters more. So to be close to the British Museum, if you're a writer, is essential. Not only because it's somewhere you can stay if you don't have much money, that's not really cold and is properly lit, but you'll also be able to get your books, and you'll see your mates who are your political allies as well. And so, that kind of physicality means you need to be close enough to be able to walk in, saving, paying for the omnibus or whatever. Cycling becomes very popular in the 1880s, 1890s, and lots of these women that we were talking about, the sort of 1890s new women, they're starting to bike because, again, it gives them a bit more autonomy. So they can start to live a bit further out. But before the bike, that's not really possible. So it's all of these things are kind of weirdly connected.
I think it was interesting looking at those in the archives. The discussions of where the National Theatre should be is really interesting because they very much have a maximum radius of where it could be west and where it could be east, and there's only a certain amount of seemingly theatrical space that it could occupy, and it's really interesting that they come to Bloomsbury for that. But I suppose there's also the Tube, the development of the Tube, and that how that opens up so much, particularly for people moving around the city, but also being able to kind of draw audiences to different spaces. For me, if I lived in a sort of Doctor Who fantasy land where I could drop myself back into, if I could drop myself back into here in 1916, and see the Shakespeare House, see the Women Police Service, on the street, go to Endell Street Hospital, go to the library there, see the amount of communicative work being done there. It was essentially radical in nature, but hugely practical in action. And maybe sometimes the disconnect between those things, the practicality. One of the interesting things about the Actresses Franchise League, that because they went on until 1958, this was not just a pre-war flash in the pan, this was 50 years of activism. Was actually they've been really hard to pin down because they did so much. They moved forward. They didn't stick on one idea and endlessly kind of recreate it or just double down on it. They moved forward to where they needed to be. And in fact, that has made them slippery to find in archives. It's made them hard for people to categorise and box, which has meant that they've kind of fallen out of those histories and those stories. And I think we see that again and again, particularly with intellectual or with activist or with engaged women in this period, working in this area and in the West End, is that they keep moving forward and they allow their interest to develop and work, and they develop their practice. They don't write the one book and live off that. They move forward, and actually that means that they slip through the net. So that area of space is as much sort of in our heads as well as in the physical space when I think about them.
I think that's a great place to wrap up, kind of thinking about how we're going to evolve Bloomsbury forwards and kind of with this moment of looking back. So I just want to say thank you so much, Naomi and Matthew, for joining us today. It's been a brilliant discussion. Thank you, everybody, for being in the room.
Thank you so much.